right, well, for those of you who work at large organizations, enterprises have no shortage of data, but having the right data and leveraging it to drive ROI for the business gets a new layer of complexity when you're working in a large organization. So Seth and Sarah are no strangers to this challenge. I have the pleasure of working with both of them as customers and of joining them for a panel discussion later after they've finished their talks and shared their experiences in building analytics practices in large organizations. So before they start, I'm going to just share a bit about both of their backgrounds. So Sarah Kaplan is the Director of eCommerce at Optimum, and Sarah leads the end-to-end digital merchandising strategy for Optimum online sales channel, making sure the right products, offers, and promotions are presented in the right way to drive growth. She and her team, some of whom are here in the audience, partner closely across marketing, design, and analytics to optimize the digital funnel, run A/B tests, and translate insights into action. And before joining Optimum, Sarah spent 5 years at AT&T in digital roles across both acquisition and existing customers, giving her a strong foundation in the full customer lifecycle. Seth Stuck, who I called out in the keynote this morning, is the Vice President of Product Research and Analytics at Fox, where he leads strategy and execution across product experimentation and engagement analytics for Fox's various, I'm sure no one has heard of them, consumer product experiences. With a background in philosophy, strategy, and analytics, Seth specializes in designing strategies for complex data systems to generate actionable insights that shape product decisions and audience experiences. All right, so let's start with Seth, who's going to talk to us about building an analytics practice at scale at Fox.
Did any of you have philosophy major speaks to you about data on your bingo card today? Probably not. Real quick, let's use our polling devices here. If you consider yourself part of it, what I would describe as an enterprise organization, and I'll get into definition terms in a moment, give me a green. And if you consider yourself more a part of a singular business, give me red. I'd just like to see the complexity of the organization or the audience. Lots of green. Okay, the greens. At least my portion will be highly relevant to you. One more question. If you consider yourself part of the product organization, give me blue. If you consider yourself maybe part of the marketing organization, orange. Finance, red. Sales, green. Everybody else, let's do white. Let's see what that looks like. What do we got? A lot of product, a little bit of green finance, a couple marketing. Okay, very good. So let's talk terms. So as Rachel mentioned, oh yeah, you have to hold down the button. I feel like I've learned that. As Rachel mentioned, I lead product research and analytics, which primarily and initially, at least when I took the role 3 years ago, was going to be focused on helping product teams improve their quality decision, improve the quality of their decisions and the confidence in the decisions. Increasingly, those same product teams are leaning on my product analytics team to help them architect, enable the data that they produce through the products to support the other functions, the non-product functions. And when you start thinking about what it means to do that in an enterprise, I think Jonathan had an interesting point in the keynote when he was talking about the extrapolated math of how many data points you have to deal with a digital product. That's a digital product. If you consider, as in the case of Fox, we have roughly 10 to 12 digital products per brand, and then we have dozens of brands. In the local television stations alone, we have 17 of those. 17 distinct businesses within one line of business, each with 10 distinct digital products, each with millions of data points. So how do you navigate that strategically as a leader, as a data practitioner? One early matrix that I developed when coming into Fox that I thought would be helpful to talk about with this group is we just needed a way to cut through across functions and across businesses to talk about where we thought we were weak and where we thought we were strong. So we devised an 80-question, 4-category maturity survey focused on these 4 areas of tooling, talent, process, and culture. We survey our various stakeholders once a year across those 80 core competencies, and they score on a competency by competency, category by category basis. And of course, we can stripe the analysis of the survey results by business or by various team groupings. But they categorize how they feel in a given core competency, like the ability to run A/B tests, as either early, average, or mature. This was the very first scorecard that you see on the screen here that we did 3 years ago. That's not where we are now. But it highlighted a couple things. One, just in the context of A/B testing on this slide, you can have a pretty robust executive level conversation by talking in that three-pronged area of early, average, and mature. Those words weren't too loaded. We didn't encounter a lot of defensiveness, and we were able to put it on a matrix like this that allowed leaders to have discussions around resourcing, strategy, and priority in a way that they could actually manage that didn't digress into the infinite scope of all the millions of data points that might come up tactically. So that's one helpful framework. My group in particular, these are our core competencies, or at least that's how my function was stood up initially. We were focused on A/B experimentation, focused on enabling and governing the data used for product KPIs, pulling in insights from across the enterprise and seeding it within the different product organizations, and even pulling in competitive intelligence to inform product decisioning. Causal inference and impact analysis is just a philosopher's way of saying do product analytics. So pre-post analyses and impact analysis, things like that, and then your traditional user and usability research. But if I just solved the data problems that I had for these core competencies, I ran into challenges. My product peers and partners who were looking to me to help them ran into challenges talking with the non-product functions about the data that they needed to enable in the product to support the other functions of the business. And again, remember, this is across dozens of businesses with distinct products. So if I had to talk, for example, about linear ad data, I can't talk about it as one metric or even 12 metrics. I have to talk about it as 12 metrics by platform, by brand, relative to the function I'm talking to. It's a very complex multivariate Rubik's Cube to try to solve. So another framework that was very helpful for us to cut through that is just dividing this into thirds. The why we measure was more focused on the business objective and what the business was trying to do with that data. The what we measure was the more operational, what does that metric look like? What are those measures? And the third, which everybody loves to jump to immediately, is what is the tech stack? How do we actually enable that? What does that look like? But by grouping it in this way, we were able to anchor in on our higher priority objectives for the data, which allowed us to reach agreement across groups that historically couldn't come to an agreement because they were focused towards the bottom of this table instead of the top of this table. Another framework that was very helpful was just landing on some strategic adjectives that we wanted to aim at. So what makes data good? What makes a data system good? These were the 5 that we thought would be useful to talk through with you guys that ultimately shaped a couple of the strategies I'll share with you here in a bit. So with regard to flexibility, I think I would summarize that to say data have to work with other data, right? When you enable any of those columns on the chart I just showed you, it can't work in isolation. It has to work across that entire platform, across that entire business, and potentially across the enterprise. Accuracy, of course, the count of things that the data seeks to capture has to be accurate, but it's also the levers for accuracy, the ability to reach in and do data restatements, the ability to implement systemic non-human traffic exclusions, things like that feed into accuracy. Contextualized, I have a little more on this in a second, but it's really just ensuring that none of those isolated columns of data are coming through without context. I have to have the necessary join keys. I have to have the necessary breadcrumbs for it to be flexible. Hierarchical, another way of saying prioritize, kind of, but also hierarchical in the sense that something in a lower order priority doesn't mean that it's unimportant. There are lots of business functions and lots of use of what I would call maybe ephemeral data events or just the sand of events that actually comprise the bulk of metrics that a business needs to set up. But if you're running a very rigid hierarchical process that says the most important things are the KPIs that power the executive reports, and all the dev work associated to supporting those reports will always take priority, you're not going to have a system that can support the sand of that mass volume of events that are needed by the other functions of the business to work. So you have to have not just a hierarchy in the sense of a prioritization, but a hierarchy in the sense of how to handle the lower order events, because they have to be handled. And then modular, not necessarily a new concept, but as you're setting up your tech stack, it's a common practice to say, hey, we want to be able to reach in and replace any element of that tech stack at any point. We went a step further and said, well, we want to be able to do that within a year. Because what can happen, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, is you'll get into bed, so to speak, with a sweet end-to-end solution, and you end up with a ton of sunk cost developed into your product in the form of tags, in the form of data architecture, in the form of integrations, and you can't get out of that system, not without a lot of expense and a lot of time. So we wanted to, from the beginning, architect a system that allowed us to plug and play any piece that we had put into the system. So this led us to a couple strategic conclusions that I wanted to share with you guys. The first is that from a dev cost perspective, we want to auto-tag everything that can be auto-tagged, which for Fox is basically everything outside of the media player and everything except for Roku, I would say. Is that fair, Rachel? Yeah. So all the click events, all the swipe events, all the tap events, impression events, if they can be auto-tagged, let's lean on Heap in our case to auto-tag it. If it can't be auto-tagged, if you're needing something more from that tagged behavioral event, leverage a user interface tool that means that you don't have a server-side dev dependency for that action, because there's a two-tiered cost to that. There's the cost of the developer that does that work, and then there's the opportunity cost of the work that developer is not doing because you now have them doing tagging work. It's very expensive organizationally, at enterprise, at scale, to manage your tagging in the client. You want to do that as little as possible. So we flipped this was actually very much on its head when we first started with Heap. We flipped it upside down and said, actually, we want most of our events to be auto-tagged. There should be very few that we have to tag, and the reason we have to tag them is some sort of functional requirement that maybe auto-tagging can't support yet. If we could auto-tag it, we would. The second key strategic conclusion that those 5 adjectives led us to is this idea of, we call it unfurling. So there's the engagement that happens in the product. There's what the user does, the taps, the swipes, the navigation, and all of that. And then there's all of the metadata associated to that, who the user is, what product they're on, what system they're using, or what system we're using to deliver that product. In the case of Fox, mountains of metadata associated to the content they happen to be watching, right? More traditional methods of tagging were packing a lot of that metadata into the payload of the tag, which has product performance challenges. Beyond that, there's the management of the quality of that metadata. If it's happening in the tag, that means you have developers who know nothing about your content, know nothing about your CDP, nothing about your users. They're just implementing tag specs. So you have 3, 4, 5, 6 potential points of failure in the metadata, the explicit metadata coding that can go wrong, and predictably it does. You end up with camel case, you end up with snake case, you have to create a bunch of data mapping to resolve for these inconsistencies, and the engineers are just bleeding out useful capacity to support these things. So instead, we pass along with the engagement data the necessary IDs behind which the metadata can be unfurled. So our engagement data comes from Heap into our warehouse. We do our data enrichment with the metadata in the warehouse, and then we push from the warehouse to our analytics endpoints. Final point on this is that allows federation of the management of the metadata quality by these functions. So we mentioned that we're going to talk about how a centralized data team works with a functional data team. It's a push-pull relationship. Yes, the product has to support the use cases of a marketing team. They have to support the use cases of a sales team. But they're also responsible, or at least increasingly responsible at Fox, for managing the metadata that they create. Marketing campaigns and the associated grouping and concatenation and all of that needs to sit with the marketing team, closest to the point of decisioning around what those campaigns are and how they should be grouped. You shouldn't have a front-end or server-side developer trying to decode that inside of your client, or literally code it. So just to recap, our ideal data set is flexible because we make sure that the necessary IDs that we need are in the engagement data payload, and the necessary joins to support all the use cases can happen downstream of data capture. It's accurate because it gives us the ability to not only make corrections upstream at a single point of failure. Instead of having a many multifaceted data input into the warehouse, we have a clean pipe into our warehouse where we can quality control the data upstream of all the places where it might be distributed. It's contextualized because the IDs allow you to pull in the necessary metadata from behind those IDs. It's necessarily hierarchical in the sense of the inverted pyramid. So we've protected the key business metrics that power our press releases, our public statements, and executive reporting as necessary through that inverted pyramid with the encode tags, but we've supported the sand as well. And then finally, it's modular because the data capture that we have that's client-side is happening in the product, native to the product. We're not reliant on a third-party system outside of the auto-tagging. And the auto-tagging is something that we're very happy. I think that HEAP has best in market auto-tagging that was mentioned this morning as well. But if at any point we needed to swap out HEAP, we could do that in our architecture and it wouldn't break anything that we've set up downstream. Our warehouse, same thing. There's a cost associated to moving that historical data, but architecturally wouldn't be a challenge. And our analytics endpoints are really where I find, at least in my career, it's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog, where you get teams that like the interface of a given tool, and then they just want to figure out all the upstream data enablement on the other side of picking the tool. This allows us to have a sufficiently robust data platform that we can set any tool on top of. So we can be tool agnostic on that analytics endpoint, and it is sufficiently modular. Whether or not we could do any of that in a year, it's aspirational, but that's how we've tried to set it up. So next, I'm going to introduce my partner, Sarah, to come up and talk to you guys about what this looks like on the other side of this equation from the functional side.
Thank you. Thanks, Seth. Hey, everybody. As Rachel mentioned, I lead digital merchandising at Optimum for our internet product. And today I'll be sharing how our team partners with the enterprise data team, a team like Seth's, to uncover gaps, partner across functions, and ultimately drive conversion for the business. First, I just want to take a moment to ground us in the bigger picture of the brands that make up Altice USA. Altice's brands are all focused on making connections easier, whether that's through businesses, consumers, and more. We do that through 3 core brands. Today's conversation will just be focused on the Optimum brand, which is where I sit. Optimum delivers internet, mobile, TV, and phone services. News 12 is our hyperlocal news anchor. And Optimum Media provides advanced advertising and data solutions. Okay, so diving more into the good stuff. So I'm bringing back a slide from Seth's portion of the presentation. And he talked a lot about how, the broader data ecosystem at Fox. So like he mentioned, I'm going to be zooming into one particular funnel that he supports and that our enterprise data team supports, which is sales. Okay, so here we're showing the 5 main sales channels. So as you see here, obviously digital is just one of many sales channels at Optimum. And within digital, we have our own data ecosystem. So we have our own partner teams, our own KPIs, and I will share more about how those digital KPIs, when paired with more of those macro level insights from our larger enterprise data team, we're able to move the business forward. So I'll just give a little bit more background too on just how those 2 teams interact. The enterprise team provides more of that macro lens for all sales channels. So looking across all of the channels we see here. They bring forward key enterprise KPIs that help across the board. My team on the digital side takes that context and applies it at more of that micro level. So what does this mean? We focus on how those insights provided by that data team apply to our channel, and we spend a lot of time thinking about the micro levers that we need to pull in order to improve those KPIs at the macro level. And then alternatively, sometimes our team will surface gaps to the enterprise team, and then we kind of work together, and it's more of that 2-way street. Okay. Now, before we get into any specific examples on how we've been able to drive change with that relationship, I want to dive a bit deeper into the types of questions and KPIs that the enterprise team at Optimum provides us to help a digital channel such as ours. So here we're showing the type of data that we get from that enterprise side. So it's things like channel share trends, speed mix, overall offer performance of the company, and anything that's more of just that long-term trajectory. For us, like I said, this is critical context. It helps answer business questions such as, are customers shifting from one channel to another? Are offers even working? How does online stack up against some of these other channels that we saw or that we do see on this slide. So broadly, this enterprise lens just keeps us grounded in the bigger picture. Now on the next slide, we'll zoom into how we take this context and translate it into those online specific KPIs that we've been hearing about all day and that we manage day to day. We'll also take a deeper look at how we work with our partner teams who are also very invested in the success of the online channel. Okay, so like I said, enterprise, big picture. However, what they don't tell us is what's actually happening inside the online experience and why. So that's where our channel-specific data comes in with some of these KPIs here on the right. So first and foremost, we are constantly monitoring the performance of our channel, and we use these KPIs on the right to understand the success of our channel, right? Like what's working, how are we tracking, what pages are converting the best, and how do we just generally increase conversion and reduce friction for our customers. From there, part of our role is to act as a translator for some of these partner teams, right? So we take what's happening in digital and we make it meaningful for each of these teams that all have different questions. So for example, marketing has the question, what creative drove the most clicks? UX is most interested in what designs are working, where are users dropping off in the customer journey. The development team just released a new set of components that they're all excited about. They want to know if those are working. And sales leadership wants to know basically everything, but just at a high level. So that's also fun. And the key is, so the key is that these different teams want different information, and they want it at different times, and it's all at different parts of the funnel, right? Without an online specific view, we can't answer those questions in the middle, and we can't answer why those enterprise level, macro level gaps exist. So in short, this slide is everything that the enterprise team can't answer, and this is what we Must Digital provide in order to fill that gap. So this is how we fill that gap. We have Adobe Analytics and Contentsquare, our two main go-to digital tools. We're upgrading to CJA. We still need to kind of suss that out. But yeah, on the left we have Adobe Analytics, which is our quantitative lens. We're all familiar with both of these tools, I hope to some degree. But this is more of the quantifying the what, how often sort of questions. Like we're using Adobe to track data across different traffic sources, devices, define custom KPIs, segment audiences, and ultimately just answer more of what's happening, how often, quantify things. And on the right-hand side, we have Contentsquare. That gives us more of that behavioral layer. We are using, the session replays, the heat maps, the zone tracking, everything that we've kind of talked about today. We can see exactly how users are interacting with the page and our components within that page to understand exactly what's happening on the site, give us deeper insights about that user behavior. So by pairing the two, we get the full digital picture. Not just the numbers that show what happened, but also the behavioral insights that explain why it happened. Now, the real impact comes is when we pair these two digital tools with the enterprise level data from a team like Seth's. Now I'll share a few examples on how that combination has driven real change for us at Optimum. Okay, so this first example has to do with speed mix, or ARPU, average revenue per user. So in this scenario, enterprise analytics showed us a gap that online customers weren't adopting higher tier plans like 1 gig, which is that one in the center there, as high as we expected based on the offer construct at the time. I think there was an extra incentive on 1 gig. Our 1 gig speed mix, which can be defined as the percent of overall sales that 1 gig makes up, was just unexpectedly low. When we dug deeper, Contentsquare showed us that the click-through rate on that 1 gig call to action was much lower on mobile than it was on desktop. Using session replays also on Contentsquare, we found that on mobile devices, users weren't even clearly seeing the 1 gig plan card on some of our landing pages. So having that in mind, we're thinking, okay, what do we do? How do we fix this? Our solution ended up being building the ability for us to spotlight a plan card on mobile. Previously, we would only be able to sort the plans from ascending order, starting with that lowest tier, or descending order, starting with that highest tier. So that change gave us some increased UX flexibility and then ultimately increased our 1 gig speed mix about 5%, or 500 basis points. Okay, example number 2. So this one has to do with add-on services. So we have this add-on called Total Care, which offers additional protection for users who purchase internet. We learned from our enterprise team, such as Seth's, that our Total Care attach rate was lagging compared to some human-assisted channels. And enterprise data just kind of made that gap clear in some cross-channel reporting, but then ultimately those digital tools led us to closing that gap and telling us more about why that gap existed. And other than the nature of digital just not being a human-assisted channel, which could have been inherently driving some of that discrepancy, right? Like it's a bit harder for us to explain why Total Care is an important add-on for users who are purchasing internet. It's not as great as a human explaining it. So that's just an inherent channel property. But when we dug deeper more in Contentsquare, we saw that some users were just skipping past this step because obviously it's optional, and they're not engaging with that content in the buy flow. So ultimately, we redesigned that component a bit, and we also made the decision to resurface it later on in the buy flow to just re-encourage users to consider adding it onto their internet in a non-intrusive way, because sometimes we see that. Those changes significantly improved attach rates. That is not a typo. It is 12,000 basis points, which is about 12%. And we're very proud of that, because then we ultimately started closing the gap to what we saw in other channels, which is ultimately driving more revenue for the business. Okay, this third example has to do with self-setup. This is my last example. So here, enterprise data showed us that online, our ratio between professional installation and self-setup was higher than some, or most, all, human-assisted channels. In other words, users online were more likely to select professional install than self-setup, which is partly because of how we merchandise it, but it's not a bad thing. So, but generally speaking, self-setup is more cost-efficient for the business. We always want to balance volume, though, with those cost savings, meaning we never want to lose out on a sale from customers not being able to get that professional installation if that's what they prefer. So ultimately, through A/B testing, we found that UX heavily influenced take rate here, as it does most things. But so things like pop-ups, default selections, pricing treatments all mattered here. And so we've just played around with some of those elements and have since seen increases in self-setup. But it's still an ongoing effort to kind of balance conversion with cost savings, which is why I kind of have this mysterious-looking squiggle here on the screen. So yeah, I'm hoping these three examples kind of illustrate the power of combining enterprise KPIs with, from teams like Seth's with online-specific insights using tools like Adobe Analytics and Contentsquare. So the enterprise view can kind of tell us where the gaps are, guide us in the right direction, and then the online tools can ultimately guide us closer to closing those gaps effectively. And then, yeah, as we wrap up, I just want to, emphasize the importance of our two teams working together. Enterprise analytics can be super helpful, like I said, giving us the macro view, critical complement to our day-to-day work that we do on the digital analytics side. And it's, as I think Rachel, you touched on it, like it's not just about gathering the data. We have so much data that we can be looking at in this industry and just in this function. But it's about asking the right questions, surfacing those insights to the right team in a language that they understand, and ultimately driving answers that matter and uncovering gaps enterprise-wide. Thank you.
I will have Rachel and Seth come join us for a quick discussion just to, talk all together about what was discussed today.
All right. Well, I'm going to dive right into the hard question, which is, I will start with Seth. So what is the most challenging part being part of a central analytics team and working with the different businesses and I guess that hub and spoke model, so the different spokes?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that principle of hierarchy. Teams and individuals want direction and they want to understand priority because everything cannot be done at once. It's important for leadership to provide some hierarchy for how to process things. That said, it's all important. And I think the most difficult part is treating all of the functional requests across all of the businesses. Some of the functions are smaller. Some of the businesses are exponentially smaller. Some are exponentially larger. Navigating that politically is challenging, but if you come at it with a spirit of, it all matters, I feel obligated as a product leader to create a system that can support all of it. I just have to navigate this conversation in a way that doesn't get me blown up before I can get to actually solutioning their problem. And the secondary point to that is the stuff that is smaller tends to be more urgent. It's that old Eisenhower grid of urgent and important. It's important and it's super urgent, but it's not maybe as important as a major product launch. And so to my couple of marketing friends in the audience, no offense, but marketing is a primary driver of this. Everything they're doing is relatively real time, and it all feels really, really important to them. But as leaders, you have to set some sort of engagement matrix that allows you to navigate that with the right blend for the business. And as long as you approach it with a spirit of like, your job matters, my support of you matters, we're gonna get you a solution, and we're gonna do it as well and as fast as we can. I think that's the best you can do, because when you start running out the extrapolated math of how many metrics, how many teams across how many businesses, how many products, you cannot do it all at once immediately the way folks want it. And you just have to navigate those relationships. That's definitely the hardest piece of it.
Okay. Sarah, what about from your point of view? What's the most challenging thing working with the central analytics team?
To the same degree, I have a similar answer. It's prioritization. I mean, if you're looking at the big picture, several teams to service, and I'm coming at it from a very zoomed in point of view, just like naturally we have different priorities. But what I have found to be successful, and this is kind of to your point, like this is what illustrating to your team, a team like yours, this is what I need today, and this is why it's important. And then this other stuff that is a part of my original request can wait. So detailing the priority, but I think to your point on the slide of like why we measure, how we measure, that people kind of jump to the how. I think I learned something on not always kind of detailing out exactly what I need, but like more, like giving more context to the enterprise data team so that they can help, so I can help them help me, I think is important and something I'll take away.
It's actually a really important point. One of our engagement models with our partner groups is don't be prescriptive. Tell me what your problem is, and let us prescribe how to solve it. But like, help me understand the priority of it. Help me understand what you're trying to do, the why, and then we'll get down to the how. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Seth, so Sarah talked about how she uses both Adobe and Contentsquare, and I know Fox and your team are users of both products too. So how have both tools together been used, and how do you?
Yeah, I think we have every combination of technology known to man across our different brands. That's part of the joy of navigating an enterprise. Every way to possibly tag an event, we've found it. I think when we do at the leadership level, when we're trying to map out sort of our budgeting for the year, is really where a lot of that gets discussed. You start mapping investments and line items in your budget to the function that they support. And if you have tools that, or if you have functions with multiple tools on that line item, that's when things start to bubble up, and then it can get a little territorial. So I found that having a really close relationship with vendor partners like Contentsquare and Heap, being a part of the roadmap, participating on the customer advisory board, all of those things to help impress upon those internal stakeholders who maybe prefer a different tool, the future vision of what you're putting in place, not just the apples to apples comparison that they're trying to make that really is apples to oranges, to maybe a legacy system that's been in place for 15 years and had the benefit of many thousands of employees to improve it versus an insurgent system that's only been there for a few months. They can't possibly be compared apples to apples because of the human labor that's gone into it. But if you can convey to those internal stakeholders the direction, the vision, the partnership that you have with the vendor, and tell a story that way that's a little more aspirational in terms of what the product will do, you have a little bit better opportunity to get those one-to-one in the budgeting process.
That's another thing we have not talked about is but the budgeting process in enterprises is always a fun one too.
It is, yeah.
Sarah, so I know you've been a user of Contentsquare for 3 years. So what's your favorite thing about it?
I think that's such a happy note to end on.
We are kind of out of time, so this might be our last. Maybe we'll have one more.
My favorite thing about Contentsquare is how visual it is. I think it really does a great job of taking something that can be abstract into something that's tangible that all functions can understand. So, I mean, and I mentioned this, but part of our role as a digital team is to take our insights and translate them for our partner teams in a way that's easy to understand and that they can also rally around. So I think us having that shared view is super helpful because it gets us away from talking about opinions, which like isn't that productive. So I think it has helped support conversations like that where we might have come to the conversation with potentially differing perspectives, but then ultimately leaning on that data that we can all very clearly see to guide the next decision.
All right, and maybe we'll end it with just one last question. So if both of you had a tip or a trick to someone who is joining maybe a larger organization and they had not worked at an enterprise before, what would you say to them?
I would say spend easily 30 days, but if you can manage it, 90 days, understanding who owns what across the entire enterprise. Functionally, tool-wise, budget-wise, team-wise, swim lane-wise, every second you spend understanding that will serve you well in the long run. Because that's ultimately the unseen challenge that you have to navigate. The technology's easy, frankly. Like the technology's all super objectively hard, I get it, but like the technology, everybody in this room is probably really smart and capable of coming up with technology solutions. When you matrix out the relationship side of it with competing priorities or potential conflicts, it doesn't matter how good you are at the technology if you can't navigate the complexities that come with an enterprise.
And just to echo that, I mean, the relationships part is crucial because relationships will supersede process when priorities get complicated. And not that I don't love a good process, I do, but sometimes like you just have to rely on what you've built and where you've established trust, because that will get you farther faster than any like systematic or like tool knowledge that you can gain over the years.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. And that's the end of the session.